I would like to say hello to everyone. I would like to introduce myself. I am Professor Kristóf Szuromi from Pázmánya Catholic University. I'm at the History Department, and this is my third actual time in Krakow, my second time physically at the university, and my very first time actually giving a lecture at the university. So special milestones for me, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present some of my research in front of you, and some of the later questions and also discoveries regarding this very fascinating topic regarding the Ottoman image, the aspects of the Ottoman image in the 16th, 17th century Central Europe. Generally, my research focused on different regions of Europe. Originally, my PhD research. But for today, I'm mostly focused on the Central European aspects, meaning I will mostly talk about the German, the Hungarian, Czech, and Polish features of the Ottoman image, but I will have some aspects regarding some of other European regions, but only just for points of reference. Also, the title is kind of clickbaity, so just to say it like that way, because I will not only include the negative image, because the research regarding the negative image of the Ottoman Empire is rather broad. So it was kind of the, let's just say, the mainstream factor in the early modern era in Europe. In my research, I also included the positive aspects of the same contemporary Ottoman image and kind of compared it to each other, where they come from. Before that, in the by the mid-15th century, they accepted that the Ottomans are unbreakable on the Balkans, so the Ottoman presence cannot be withdrawn from the Balkans, so they have to that situation, but at least they could contain it. But after Constantinople, they saw that the Ottomans are becoming a, let's just say, global level threat for Christianity itself. And also they started to depict the Ottomans in the most negative way in the wake of the capture of Constantinople. In many cases, they talked about the death of Greek culture, the second death of Homer and Plato. So you see a lot of these shocked literary sources from this time period. After 3 years, you had the Battle of Nándorfehérvár in modern-day Belgrade, which is a victory against the very same army that took Constantinople, and this is why it has so much leverage 3 years later. And this is why Europe and the papacy was so paying attention towards the siege of Belgrade in 1456. But the other main step was the capture, the siege and capture of Otranto in southern Italy in 1480, which demonstrated that the Ottomans are not stopping at the Balkans. They are not just pushing northwestwards, but they are moving westwards in the western half of the Mediterranean, and also they're entering the Italian peninsula, which is also a bit more dramatic towards the Italian states, Venice, Genoa, and also the Papal State as well. Although the Ottoman presence at Otranto was very short-lived, but it again resulted in a series of depictions and writings about the brutality of the Ottomans, how they took Otranto, how much damage did they do. But overall, again, it had a high shock value for the western half of the Mediterranean and Europe itself. Not to mention, there was in the very same year an larger Ottoman raiding campaign into Steiermark, which shocked the Holy Roman Empire, because that's the furthest the Ottomans have ever gone at that point. And also we entered the 16th century, because the Battle of Mohács in 1526 is not just a milestone in the Hungarian history and in the Hungarian culture and historical memory, but it was also a milestone for the local Croatian forces, Germans, Poles, and even the Czechs as well, and not to mention the Germans as well. So it was an international army, despite it was being coordinated by the Hungarian king, who was at the same time king of Hungary and Bohemia. So both states lost their ruler on the field of Mohács at 1526, and that's the point when the Czechs actually started more and more diving into the negative imagery of the Ottomans. Before that, the Ottoman threat was distant, but Belgrade is a bit more exotic when you see it from Prague. when you talk about the capturing of Buda in 1541, that's much more closer for even the average Czech person, Bohemian person who lives there, or even the person living in German territory such as Vienna or modern-day North and Northwestern Austria. So Mohács and Buda were shocking, of course, to the Hungarian side, but it also sent shockwaves in Central and also into Western Europe. The Ottoman Empire just defeated one of their main rivals, one of the stopgaps between Western Europe and the Balkanic region. So it resulted, again, in more negative and more shocking imagery of the Ottomans. And it is in this context, when the siege of Vienna happened in 1529, when it shows that the Ottomans are now pushing towards into Western Europe, entering into Vienna's territory and almost capture it. But they successfully defended Vienna, but with tremendous casualties. But overall, it was also a breaking point, a milestone in the German language area regarding the Ottoman imagery, regarding the Ottoman conquest. What is the result that they actually draw from these lists of traumas? Basically, is that the Ottoman army is unstoppable. What they see is that major Christian powers are defeated, major Christian coalitions are defeated in open field battle against the Ottoman army, especially when it is led by the Sultan. It is unnecessary then to fight them in open field because they are unbeatable. And also generals, even experienced generals, were hesitating to afterwards meet the Ottomans in open battle for decades to come. It needed a certain progress that even European generals would actually volunteer to meet them head on and not just focus on defensive structures and the defensive systems. So with that, the Ottomans would take their central place in this enemy image in Europe, and this enemy image is multi-layered, and it is slowly but surely progressing to be a multi-layered nature. On one level, the surface level is, of course, the physical enemy, the military enemy. That is the Ottoman Empire. That is the Turkish soldier. That is the Ottoman army. And as a physical enemy, they are describing them, how they are functioning, how they are doing in battle, how they are fighting, how they are behaving during siege time, during campaign season, or after the battle. And in these sources, even in 15th century sources, even in 16th century sources, even in 17th century sources, they usually write about an emphasis about the cruel nature of the Ottoman soldiers, the wild, barbaric nature of the Ottoman soldiers, that they are very sadistic, they are focusing on torturous executions, such as impaling their opponents, they are very aggressive, they are always on the attack. They had Italian sources mentioning that the Ottomans do not respect the Christian manner, that whenever someone drops their weapon and surrenders, they are saved. The Ottomans kill them nonetheless. And for example, they have mentioning about dragging people into slavery, selling them on slave markets in Istanbul, but also decapitating their opponents and getting reward for the decapitated heads of those former Christian prisoners. So in the physical sense, in the military sense, you have this focus on their brutality. But on the other side, they also focus on their formidability. In their sources, they write that the Ottoman army is very similar to the Spartans. They are formidable, they are disciplined, they don't need much food, they behave well, they handle the harsh circumstances very well, and this makes them very good fighters, and they are a unified force compared to the Christian armies, who are bickering amongst each other. The soldiers, the mercenaries are getting drunk, they are getting into fights, and they do not focus on fighting the actual enemy. So on the other hand, you see a comparative element, and they say that comparatively the Ottomans are actually a proper military fighting force, similar to the old Romans or the Trojans or the Spartans of the antiquity. On the other level, you have the more deeper meaning, because they are the religious enemy. They are Muslim, they are non-Christian. And you have a literature, a wide variety of literature from the 7th century AD up till the 17th century AD that is constantly thinking about Islam in Christian sense. What is Islam? Is it a non-Christian? Is it a different religion altogether, or does it comes from Christianity? I.e., is it a type of heretical sect of Christianity? So thought the contemporary Christian writers in the 7th century. So it was fascinating to Christian thinkers, clerics as well. What is Islam? This is why I wrote there, as you see, that there isn't still a debate in the early modern period whether they call the Ottomans or Muslims in general pagans or heretics or something like that, because it's not the same. It's a very two different categories, but altogether it means that they are an enemy on a spiritual level, on a religious level. They are other than the Christian groups that they are writing about them. And in general, by the 16th century, the Ottomans are overall regarded as the foe of Christianity, the arch nemesis of Christianity. Erzfeind der Christenheit, so says the German literature as well. So it is becoming a general threat, not just on a military level, not just on an imperial level, but also on a spiritual and religious level and cultural level as well. And even one step further, you see the apocalyptic nature, the spiritual and apocalyptic nature of the Ottomans, again, regarding these writings, is that the Ottomans are not just pagans, they are not just enemies, they are also the Antichrist. You had several aspects of the Antichrist, but because the Ottomans were undefeated, you cannot beat them. They are constantly expanding into Europe. It means that there is a reason behind those series of victories. What can it be? And the Ottomans, slowly but surely, are being seen as a divine punishment of God. Very similar as the Mongols were seen as, very similar as the Huns were seen, or the Vikings, or even the Hungarians back in the day, as the just punishment of God, who are here to cleanse Christianity from the bad element of the Christians. And therefore, Christianity must cleanse itself from their sins, from their problems, before they can actually overcome this threat, this vital threat. There is one theory. There was the other theory in the 16th century that's saying that it's useless because the Ottomans are the forerunners of the apocalypse, because they are either the people of the apocalypse, so they are bringing forward the final battle, the Armageddon battle, or they are the physical manifestation of the Antichrist itself, with the, depending on which confession you are viewing, with the Pope being either the spiritual manifesto of the Antichrist or Martin Luther being the spiritual manifestation of the Antichrist, depending on which denomination you are reading. Usually this anti-Ottoman literature, this anti-Ottoman narrative also gets a inter-denomination aspect as well, because Protestantism and Catholicism are in tension with each other at this time period, of course. But it means that the Ottomans are having a much deeper meaning of the enemy. They are the final enemy. They are the capital enemy of not just Christianity, but globally as well. And this idea that the Ottomans are a means of divine punishment can also be seen at the Catholic sources and also on the Protestant sources. Of course, both sides are blaming each other for this problem in and of itself. But overall, there is kind of an understanding between the sides that yes, the Ottomans are a punishing method from God. How you handle this punishment is up to debate. The Catholics say that you must actively fight against it. The Protestant side mostly would talk either about defensive war or just letting it happen because it will eventually be good, but you must endure for this first couple of years. But also the Antichrist image gets more and more complicated as we move forward, because now you have this double and triple Antichrist element. People are at this point basically waiting for the end of the world to happen, because different elements are happening, different in the nature, in politics, in the Ottoman threat. And you see that you had the double and triple aspect of the Ottomans. What does this mean? The double Antichrist means that the Ottomans or the Antichrist have a double aspect, a physical and a spiritual. This is why I talked about earlier. So we have the Ottomans as a physical manifestation, and either the Pope or one of the Protestant reformers being the spiritual manifestations of the Antichrist, and together they form the Antichrist itself. But also they have this imagery, this illustration, that they have a double or three-headed creature as the beast, as the Antichrist. And one of the head is usually a turbaned Ottoman head. The second head, again, if you see at the Protestant illustration, that this is a head of the Pope. And the third one is a nice-headed, a beautiful-headed element, because that is the face of an angel, the angel of deception, because the Antichrist was meant to deceive. That's one aspect. But also there's a combination when you had the Ottoman as one head, the Pope as another head, and Martin Luther is the third head, because that was a Calvinist depiction. So it was depending on the denomination. Feel free to combine the heads as per your actual denomination in the 16th century. But it immediately is seen that how the Ottomans are being depicted and also included into this end times narrative in late medieval and early modern Christian Europe. Also, more and more they start to bring up the biblical texts about the apocalypse, such as the book of David, the book of Daniel, and also the book of Revelations. Both talk about the end of the world, and both are being reinterpreted in the 16th, 17th century by Martin Luther, by Melanchthon, by Peter Pázmánya, so you name it, all the major intellectuals from these two centuries are thinking about these notions or revelations or these predictions from the Bible. How can you interpret it based on actual events that are happening? And based on that, they could give predictions that, according to that, in which year, where would happen the end of the world or the final battle. There was a German prediction that the final battle, so the Armageddonic battle, would happen at Nuremberg, between the big Ottoman armies and their allies, and the last standing forces of Christianity, the Germans, the remaining Hungarians, and the French, and all the other Christian forces, and that would be the final battle. So there's one German prediction from, again, late 15th, early 16th century Germany. But also you can see that with these several layers, the Ottomans are included as the great other, or mentioned as the great other. So different on a religious basis, on a cultural basis, and also in every aspect it is adversive to the previously established Christian European structure. So it is also that layer that makes the Ottomans the central piece of, or the big capital E enemy during the Reformation period as well, on both Protestant and Catholic sides as well. Martin Luther had a very interesting theory. Martin Luther wrote about the three Turks, and after Luther, other Protestant thinkers, intellectuals wrote about this. What does the three Turks mean? It's basically what I'm talking about for 30 minutes now. It is the three major layers of the enemy. There is the physical Turk, the external Turk. That is the Ottoman Empire. So that's the more clean-cut enemy. But there is also the internal Turk. That is basically division in the community. You have some partisanry, division, misunderstanding. So there is internal tension that is preventing the community from being unified. And there's also the inner Turk, which is the spiritual level. It's kind of the sins and unclean thoughts. So your personal, let's just call it your personal Turk, basically. So in Luther's idea, Christianity or the Christian powers cannot defeat the Ottomans because they need to cleanse themselves on a spiritual level, on an individual level, then on a community level, and after that, they could actually morally overcome the great enemy and then finally defeat them in a physical manner as well. So after the siege of Vienna, Luther starts to write about these theories about how to spiritually overcome the enemy. And a lot of other Protestants also are in agreement with this idea that first it comes the spiritual nature, then the military victory. So immediately you see that by the mid-16th century, there is a high intellectual and theological debate regarding either not just the end times, but also how must the Christian powers, European powers, react and how should they behave in the Ottoman threat. Of course, Martin Luther says that the anti-Ottoman war should be coordinated by the Holy Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Emperor because he is head of the strongest Christian empire, the Pope. And how the Ottomans are mentioned as an enemy, how the enemy image is affecting also society is well demonstrated in this excerpt I brought you here from early 17th century Hungary and Transylvania. There was an incident that a group of Haiduks, these nice fellows back on the picture, these were irregular soldiers. So it means that they are light infantry, light cavalry. They were mostly equipped for guarding castles, conduct raids. So this asymmetric warfare style. So they were kind of these contemporary guerrillas, if you like. Now these Haiduks had a very ill reputation. So they were also, of course, very brave, but they also were very brutal, of course, because of their nature. And a group of Haiduks who, from the Hungarian side, entered Transylvania. Transylvania was a separate state at that point, and it was under Ottoman vassalage. They entered Transylvania and they raided several Transylvanian cities. And here it was Szamosújváros. And according to Ferenc Nagyszabó, who was an eyewitness of the situation, he says the following: when we pleaded them not to hurt us, do not do ungodly things, for we are also Hungarians and Christians, and God will punish them. But they answered, each all of you are Turks with hair, and are bought by the Turks. You are dogs, and we are not sorry for you, so help us God, we shall cut you down like a Turk, end quote. What does this mean? It means that they just overshadowed them, they just basically mentioned them on the same level as the enemy. You are not Hungarians, you are not one of us, you are Turks. Therefore, you are the enemy, therefore we can do anything against you. It is legal, it is fair from our side. By the way, the Haiduks added that we do not fear from God because we have left him on the other side of the Tisza River, end quote. So it was kind of their mentality. But overall, this is just one excerpt. The other was, for example, during the 30 Years' War, when the Bohemian uprising was defeated by the imperial forces. And you had diplomatic connections between Protestant Bohemian nobles and the Ottoman Empire, which were then caught by the Habsburg imperial agents, and they had hard proof that the Protestant rebels are cooperating with the Ottomans. Nothing is simpler. The imperial propaganda can then use it as they are working with the enemy. They are not just rebels, they are not just Protestants, but they are also collaborating with the Turk. Therefore, they are just half Turk. Therefore, anything goes. And in Prague, they allowed 7 days of free looting. I suppose you kind of know what that means. And also a large portion of the Bohemian nobility who took part or supported the rebellion were executed. And basically the Bohemian culture was, and linguistic culture and also political culture was set in stone for almost a century after that. So it resulted in a brutal, harsh punishment from the empire. And in propaganda-wise, they mention it because they are collaborating with the enemy. They are practically the enemy and functioning as the enemy. Same here on a lower level. Haiduks don't do propaganda. So this is a community-level punishment that was set up, that was used by them against also maybe fellow ethnic Hungarians, because these cities were that was set up, that was used by them against also maybe fellow ethnic Hungarians, because these cities were also half German, half Hungarian in that. Also, How does the German side sees the Ottomans? How does the German side sees the Turk? Now, the German is the most elaborate. In the 16th century, you see the title Türkenfurcht, the fear of the Turk. It is a general umbrella terminology. Basically, anything that resulted in the Ottoman conquest, there was a huge panic throughout the empire, and it resulted in a series of songs, prayers, writings, sermons, dramas, anything you can imagine. So it actually resulted on a cultural level, because it was not just published by church officials, it was also by local communities and also on a state level. So it had also different layers as well. So it had a large cultural impact on the German territories as well. And the so-called Türkenfurcht had several phases. The most darkest phase was actually the 16th century. So when they besieged Vienna the first time, up till the time of the end of the 15 Years' War. Because what is the biggest result of the 15 Years' War is that the Ottomans can be beaten on open field. So the European armies, the imperial armies defeated the Ottomans several times, and both empires were bloodied by the end of the war. So the fear against the Ottomans, the fear of the Ottomans being unstoppable, undefeated, is now a myth. And it is now realized that if you have a competent enough commander, if you organize your forces well enough, you can actually beat the Ottomans. And it's a turning point on a moral level in the Holy Roman Empire. Because after 1606, for a couple of decades, the Ottoman threat is not forgotten, but is not on that epic apocalyptic level as it was before that. If we go into the 1660s, we see this fear returning. Because in the 1660s, there is a time of military reform in the Ottoman Empire, the age of the CEEPUS. And they want to bring back none other than Suleiman's era, when the empire was on the advance, was on the expansion. And this is why the Ottoman military activities are much more active in the 1660s. Therefore, the panic also was being brought up in the German territories once again, because the memory of that Ottoman expansion was still on a social level, still recognizable. And it culminates in 1683, of course, the last Ottoman siege of Vienna, where is absolute panic throughout the empire and also Europe as well. And also because of the size, the sheer proportion of the siege and the battle, you have hundreds of thousands of people there from all around the continents, from Europe and Asia, because you had from Tatars to Turks to Serbs to from Hungarians and Germans and Poles and Lithuanians and everyone you have around Vienna. An average person would reasonably think that this is the Armageddon, because everyone from the world is now coming together under Vienna and fighting. But so there is a high point of the fear, but also a high euphoria because of the victory. And after that, this fear against the Turk is dying down on the Austrian level, on the German level, and it's slowly but surely being exchanged by just the defeat the enemy, defeat the great rival mentality. And it had also, as I mentioned, long-term cultural effects, both in church levels, in sermons. So you had this so-called Türkenpredigen, when the pastor would talk about the sins of the community and how the Ottomans are punishing them, and let's pray for God to get rid of us from this Ottoman punishment. But you also had a lot of illustrations, book illustrations, contemporary newspapers, church depictions, anything. So even Bible illustrations included Ottoman elements when the topic called for it. This is one of the depictions of this more artistic level. It is made by Hans von Aachen. Hans von Aachen was a painter who professionalizes in the allegoric style, and he did a series about the 15 Years' War. And this depiction is the declaration of war. So it is the start of the 15 Years' War in front of Constantinople. And in the picture, you can see these elements that I was talking about, that the Turk is the aggressor, that the Turk is the darker, on a darker level, because if you see the picture and if you analyze the picture, what you see Well, a lot of Greco-Roman elements. So behind the Ottoman, wielding the saber, you see the Furies, the goddesses of wrath. Also beneath them, you see a growling dog with a turban on its head, which is mildly fascinating. But this depiction is very interesting because the Germans had a terminology for the Ottomans. They called them the Bluthund, the bloodhound. And it is the highest level of insult you can give to someone in contemporary Europe. Even in modern day Europe, you can insult people with saying that. But this is also an artistic depiction of that German phrase existing in the 17th century. On the other side, what do you see? You see the Habsburg diplomat, who is not violent, who is passive. Behind him is Hercules, so the hero figure, the righteous hero figure, the coats of arms of the dynasty, of the Habsburg dynasty. Above them, the gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon are watching all over them. So it's a very epic piece as well. And the text is covering it out, but underneath you can see a person who is chained to the ground. And also the diplomat is being chained. So they are helpless in the Ottoman attack. They are just waiting for the blow to come. But behind them, you had this righteous, heroic backing as well. So is it propagandistic? Yes, it is. But also you can see the cultural elements as well. And also it contains very interesting nuances about contemporary diplomacy. I need to mention this because the diplomat, as I mentioned, this is a Habsburg diplomat. And he's not dressed as a German. He's not dressed as a Western European. The clothes are specifically Transylvanian or Hungarian, so definitely Central European. And that is a reason, because we know that the diplomat in the Ottoman Empire always represented the King of Hungary and not the Holy Roman Emperor. Therefore, if he represents the King of Hungary, he should dress as such. Therefore, he had Hungarian-style clothes, no matter what the diplomat's ethnicity was. I think at this time he was from either from Bohemia or from Austria, but he was not Hungarian, but he was still dressed as such. So we also still have historic information, even in allegorical paintings. What about other territories in Central Europe? As I mentioned, in Bohemia, it is the Battle of Mohács that is the actual turning point for the Bohemian intellectuals and the Bohemian political leadership and the Bohemian citizenry who would take the Ottoman threat more seriously afterwards. Because the King of Bohemia died on the field of battle as well at Mohács. And also Buda was captured. So the frontier is pouring closer and closer to Prague, to the Bohemian territories. And also the Bohemian clergymen, intellectuals were interested in the Ottoman nature, in the Ottoman Empire, and also in Islam as well. And as I mentioned, you had writings about Islam. You had the writings about the teachings of the Quran. These were called the Quran confutations. So compare the teachings of the Quran with the teachings of Christianity, and basically, what are the similarities, what are the differences, and who is right in this debate. So it's kind of that, it's a critical work. And two people, Bartolomej Dvorsky and Václav Budovec, wrote the two most famous Quran confutations of their time. Both were actually of Protestant origin. And both wanted to publish these works to raise awareness among the Christians, saying that because of the similarities and sometimes the difficult nature of these religious nuances, people can be tricked into converting into the other religions. So people must be prepared. The priests must be prepared for a religious debate, and also the local population must be prepared for any intrusion of other religious elements. So this was kind of the fighting the Great War on a spiritual basis meant for these intellectuals on a Catholic side and also on the Protestant side as well. And again, you see this Lutheran narrative returning in the Bohemian side as well. Christians need to purify themselves, need to be morally better than the enemy before they can achieve an actual victory as well. And no matter what confession you are, no matter if you are Calvinist, if you are Lutheran, if you are Catholic, you must join forces. except if you're an anti-Trinitarian or Unitarian, because then you are half Turk and you are not to be taken seriously. And I am not exaggerating. This was the narrative about the anti-Trinitarians, not just in Bohemia, but also in Hungary, in Transylvania, and also in Germany. So they were the odd one out in these religious groups as well. So you see a lot of overlaps and similarities of the German narratives in Bohemia, but not as panicky, not on the same level on intensity as the German one that you saw, but it is definitely a intensive negative image of the Ottomans. In Poland, you also see similar elements. You also have the similar narratives, but of course, a large proportion of these conflicts were against the Tatars, Muslim faction nonetheless, but not the Ottomans. But overall, because of the conflicts, the constant engagements against the Crimean Khanate, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth also used the Propugnaculum Christianitatis, the bulwark of Christianity narrative, as part of their identity. And of course, after the 1620s, they also engage more and more in fightings against the writings here, such as you can see written by Starowolski, again talking about the moral superiority, the moral cleanness. You should not delve into this Eastern comfort and Eastern elements. You must be pure, you must be simple, and then you should not get yourself into morally ambiguous situations. But also you have the Jesuit Piotr Skarga, who wrote the Messias Arianorum, again a Quran confutation of his time, which was also, as a contemporary work, both an anti-Ottoman piece of work and both an anti-Unitarian and anti-Protestant piece of work as well. So these, as I mentioned, these intellectual works are element not just in the anti-Ottoman narrative, but also in this inter-confession conflict as well, all throughout Europe as well. And two historical narratives are also very interesting in the 17th century. One was written by Martin Gruneweg, and the other one was Simeon of Poland. Martin Gruneweg was born in Gdańsk, and he was of German origin because he was a German citizen in Gdańsk, who was originally a Protestant. He converted to Catholicism, he joined the Dominican order, and then with a group of Armenian merchants, he traveled to the Ottoman Empire. He had a colorful life, let's just say that. So Martin Gruneweg had a very vibrant narrative and memoir of his travels. On one side, he writes about how splendid Constantinople looks, how well organized Constantinople is, and also the local Turks living there are also well behaved, also well disciplined. But on the other hand, he also kind of warns over the fact that the Hagia Sophia, the holy places of Christianity, are not in the hands of Christians anymore. So you see this duality and this conflict in Martin Gruneweg's narrative. Simeon of Poland is another interesting figure because he was of Armenian origin. It's called also Simeon Lehatzi, so he's in his Armenian name. And Simeon also traveled to the Ottoman Empire, and also he didn't just stop at Anatolia, but he also went down to Egypt. And he was particularly interested in the Armenian communities living in the Ottoman Empire. And also, of course, he also needed the necessary travel to Constantinople, because everyone needs to travel to Constantinople at least once in their lifetime. So Simeon writes very similarly to Gruneweg, Constantinople is magnificent. It's well organized. It's beautiful. When he went to Anatolia, he was much more afraid because he found a local Armenian priest. He said that if you want to travel to deep into Anatolia, then leave your horse with me and take this sack clothing, because your nice clothings are also kind of a target. Just go very simple, and they were a very simple animal, because if they see you like that, you will get beaten and killed. There's a high chance. So let's just get out of hindsight. But overall, he saw that in the Armenian communities, they were living there. The Christian minorities had their restrictions. They could not rebuild their churches, meaning that if the church collapsed, then the church collapsed. They could have houses, but not the houses could not be nicer or larger than the local Muslims' house. So you had according to him, you had these types of limitations. But overall, he saw that even in the smallest Anatolian village, you see a well, and on the well you see the freshly poured out water in a jug as well for travelers to drink. It is, and he also mentions that as well. So immediately you see this again ambiguity. He refers also to the nice elements of the Muslim population, but also he mentions the restrictions, the atrocities as well. When he went to Egypt, and I again quote him verbatim, he said that I cannot wait to go back to Constantinople, end quote, because he did not like being in Egypt, because at one time he was almost robbed in Egypt. So that was his local trauma as a traveler. But his work has another element, because it was published in two pieces. One piece talks about his travel, and the other piece talks about the Ottoman war in Poland in 1620. And you see nothing about the previous narrative. He talks about the Ottomans as the dragons, as the barbarians, as the enemies. So immediately you see the wartime narrative, the very same Central European wartime narrative coming back into Simeon's mindset as well. It's unrecognizable than the previous book. Hungary, similar to Poland, had the Propugnaculum Christianitatis, or Bulwark of Christianity topos. It's very important in the self-identity of the Hungarian military society and of course the Hungarian nobility as well. And it will slowly but surely involve itself into the Hungarian national identity in the 18th, 19th century as well. And there is no difference if you are a Protestant, if you are a Catholic. Most of the Ottomans are talked about in a negative fashion. You would say it is logical because now the Ottomans are possessing more than half of the country at that point. These quotations I show you here are from a Calvinist pastor. Melius Juhász Péter was his name. He referred to the Ottomans as bloodhounds or the devils of Mohács. So he had a local type of insult towards the Ottomans. But they were never mentioned in a positive way, despite there were some narratives saying that the Ottoman presence in Hungary is actually a good thing towards the Protestants. Melanchthon once wrote in the 1540s that the Ottoman presence is good for the Protestants because they are not being persecuted as under the Catholics. There was an answer from a Hungarian Lutheran to Melanchthon saying that while what you are saying is at this point true, it is too good to be true actually, because you see that in the southern regions in Hungary, you don't see any Hungarian now, and you see probably the Ottomans are working in Hungary to be more favorable towards the Protestants to eventually convert them to Islam. So that was their fear in the mid-16th century. So there was some positive remarks, but overall the tendency is kind of a overall negative as the conquering half of the country shows it. The apocalyptic image is also present in Hungary. The Gog and Magog, the famous biblical parallel, Gog and Magog, is again present in the Hungarian narrative, not just in the German and Bohemian as well. According to the legend, Alexander the Great built a great gate in the Caucasus, great metal gate, and the forces of the apocalypse, the people of the apocalypse, the people of Gog and Magog are bashing Alexander's gate. And when they break through the Caucasus, they enter Europe, and that is when the end times, the apocalypse comes. And this is the Gog and Magog legend, which is also, as I mentioned, prevalent in Hungary as well. In Hungary, of course, he also has another element, which is on a social level. It is the crime of Turkishness. And the crime of Turkishness is very general. I would say if you're an average university student, you would probably fall into the crime of Turkishness, because the crime of Turkishness includes drinking coffee, smoking tobacco. Yeah. So And also, of course, collaborating with the enemy. So if you borrow anything cultural from the enemy, it is Turkishness. If you imitate something from the enemy, Turkishness. Again, if you convert to Islam, that is most radical, so this is the lowest chance, but of course that is Turkishness. But if you cooperate onto the minute details, you can get into the prime of Turkishness. The problem is that this is punishable by death. And in the borderlands, meaning that this militarized zone in the border areas of Hungary, you had no centralized local government. It means that if the local garrison comes out to gather the taxes, ask that who became Turk in the last couple of weeks since we have been here, maybe someone will be pushed in their front saying that he was committing Turkishness. What type of Turkishness the community says, and he is executed on the spot without any proper jurisdiction. Maybe it was based, maybe he was actually collaborating with the Ottomans. Maybe it is just a story about humans, and they just didn't like him, and they just throw him under the metaphorical bus in this case. So there was this morally quite ambiguous nature of the punishment, but overall this element of Turkishness was again handled in a very harsh method in Hungary as well. Being compared to a Turk is considered the highest insult in Central Europe and in the Balkans in the same time period. Even in the Balkans, if you say that you're worse than a Turk, it's one of the highest it's one of the highest insults you can possibly imagine. One time, a German source mentioned, the German mercenaries said that the Hungarians are worse enemy than the Turks. I don't know what they mean about that, but it definitely doesn't mean good. So it was a level of either instability, cruelty, unpredictableness, or just revel in aggressivity. It depends on the historical source. And also you have these bestseller sources similar to other parts of Central Europe. Georgius de Hungária, George of Hungary, and Bartolomé Georgievich, so he is a Serbian of origin, but he fought in the Battle of Mohács, both wrote their memoirs because both of them fell in Ottoman captivity, and they spent years as an Ottoman captive, and they escaped. And when they returned home, they wrote their experiences, and people were very fascinated because these people came from Ottoman captivity. They know details. So it's very similar than today. If someone comes from a very secluded country, every part of the media is focused on them because they have that extra information. And their works were translated to several languages. They were republished. So this was, and then I'm not exaggerating, they were the bestsellers of that time. So basically anything that is about Ottomans was considered a bestseller in the 16th, 17th century. And of course, the Jesuits in Hungary continued that intellectual tradition, similar to Poland, similar to the Protestants in Bohemia, about confutations of the Quran. Péter Pázmány himself wrote one, and István Szántó Orátor, probably you know Péter Pázmány better since I introduced my university, but also István Szántó Orátor also wrote a very elaborate confutation. In style, in context, they are very similar to the other Central European ones. They're talking about the teachings of Islam, how it is false, of course, but also they are talking about how the Protestants are in the wrong in that debate, how Martin Luther was wrong in their original idea. So it is both the anti-Ottoman and the anti-Protestant piece of work as well. I included Transylvania because it has some similarities with Hungary, but also it has some special elements because Transylvania exists, but it exists as a vassal state to the Ottomans. The Prince of Transylvania has to be elected, and it has to be accepted by the Sultan, and it has to be accepted by the Holy Roman Emperor as well. So both sides have to accept the Prince of Transylvania, and the Prince has some liberties, but they cannot overextend their field. So they have to consult with the Sultan before doing anything rash. Otherwise, it will result in a very radical punishment from the Ottomans. And it is seen in the 16th, 17th century, especially in the 17th century, when Gábor Bethlen involved himself in the 30 Years' War. He was allying himself with the Bohemian rebels. He was also a Protestant. And what happens is that Bethlen has the Sultan's approval, because he's fighting against the Catholic Habsburg Imperials. He is taking territory away from the Kingdom of Hungary under the influence of the Prince of Transylvania. So this is again in line with the Ottoman Sultan's general goals. But even Gábor Bethlen writes a letter to the Nádor of Hungary, so the second highest rank in the Kingdom of Hungary, saying that I really hope that the war will come an end and the peace talkings will start very soon. He wrote this in 1619, 1620. It was the start of the 30 Years' War, so his predictions were wrong, but his hopes were wrong. So he was hoping the peace talks would start shortly. And I quote, before the Ottomans changed their attention from Poland to Transylvania, and we will be the last Christian kingdom to fall, end quote. So he says that the Ottomans are having their attention bogged down either by the Persians or with the Polish war in 1620, but it is a matter of time when the Ottomans get involved, because for the Ottomans, the 30 Years' War, when Christian powers are killing each other, was a perfect scenario. And this is for back then, the Ottomans were still being viewed as a threat, as a general threat to Christianity. But if used in the right way, in the right methods, it can be used also as a diplomatic political tool as well. Put more pressure on the Habsburgs, put more pressure on the Habsburg diplomacy, because if I engage in some diplomatic and military actions, if I say I have Ottoman soldiers as auxiliary forces, you can put pressure on Vienna. This is the reason why the Protestant Bohemians also started negotiating with the Ottomans on a possible, and I quote, military coalition. They probably didn't want to have a military coalition with the Turks, but a possible one, because it would put pressure on Vienna to be more cautious with them. It backfired, as I mentioned, because they found out about this and the punishment I talked to you about earlier. So it can function as a tool. Some Transylvanian princes used it effectively. Some used it very poorly, and it resulted in the sacking of Transylvania. 14,000 people were dragged into slavery by the Tartars in the mid-1600s. So it can backfire in that level, as history would also tell us as well. And also the Ottoman image in Transylvania remained also in its negative features almost the longest in Europe. Because in this 18th century, you even see a very negative, very 16th century-like image of the Ottomans. It is a depiction of Saint Hrypsime. Saint Hrypsime is an Armenian saint. So she is one of the earlier Armenian saints. And in Szamosúlvár, so in Transylvania, modern-day Romania, you had Armenian communities living there. And Saint Hrypsime, the story of her is a tragic one. She was fleeing from a political marriage. She was without virginity, and the local then pagan king of Armenia desired her, wanted her to become his wife. She denied it, and Hrypsime and her 30 companions were tortured to death and executed later on. So it's a very tragic story. And in the depiction, you can see it is from 1778. It's the time of Maria Theresa. It is basically the time of the Enlightenment in Europe. So it is, the Ottomans are viewed as a interesting, exotic element. But in the Armenian communities, you see this type. The people who are torturing and executing the nuns are actually depicted as Turks. And this also kind of conserves and follows on this long-term memory in Transylvania. There is another narrative, another memory in Hungary from Maria Theresa's time, is that when the Hungarian nobility were given the chance to either join Maria Theresa or against her, they joined Maria Theresa in the War of Succession, mostly because the previous Ottoman war was pretty bad, and they would say that Hungary alone would not be powerful enough to withstand a possible Ottoman invasion in this say, in mid 18th century. So the Ottoman memory is still being kept in these parts of Central Europe. And finally, just for a couple of minutes, just to talk about some positive stuff, there is an interesting side note that in the 16th century, the Turk or the merciful Samaritan from the biblical story can be seen as depicted as a Turkish figure. And not just any Turkish figure, a person who can wield a weapon, because you see in both pictures, the saber is on his side. The first picture I started to analyze in my PhD research was a Lutheran picture of Zwickau in Germany from 1574, 3 years after the Battle of Lepanto, a couple of years after the Treaty of Adrianople. So the high level of the Turkish fear in Germany, might I add. The high level of the apocalyptic fear as well. Probably the template of this picture was from a 10 years older illustration of the Amman Bible. Amman Bible is getting his name from Jost Amman. Jost Amman was an illustrator working in the Feierabend business, and he specifically did illustrations for Martin Luther's Bible translation. And there is the story of the merciful Samaritan. As you can see, so it is perfectly aligned. So the posture, just the colors are the differences, some nuances, and the whole thing is actualized. So in the story of the merciful Samaritan, you can see the priest and the Levite, the two clergymen who leave the wounded man next to the road to his fate, are now portrayed as a Protestant and a Catholic, a Lutheran pastor and a Catholic bishop. And the Samaritan who helps the wounded, who helps the man in need, is portrayed as a Turk. So it is definitely not a method to show an Oriental topic, an Oriental feature, because you say non-Oriental feature, people here. The buildings are definitely Germanesque, European, not Oriental. But the Samaritan is Turkish. Again, in the Amman Bible as well. This raises the question, is this some one-off thing? Is this some one-time experiment, or was this something special? I have good news, this was something special. So because these were church drawings and Bible illustrations, I found two more 30-40 kilometers difference. So there's one near Dresden, one in Schopau, one in Naumburg. So it is Saxony, Protestant Saxony, basically, and a couple of decades differences. So between 1574 and 1612, basically. So a generation of difference kind of. And because of these are church-related imagery, you should have some sermons, speeches about it. And luckily there were some. So there were actually Protestant German sermons regarding that. And in the first half, I thought this was some Protestant thing. And after that, this whole theory went out of the window, because then I thought Catholic sermons talking about the same parallel as well. And what is the parallel, basically? Just to put it simply, one narrative says that Jesus specifically mentions the Samaritan in this speech because, and I quote the German Protestant narrative, because it is, as we today would say, a scoundrel or a Mameluke. Mameluke is very close to the Turk in the European mindset, so it's there in the aesthetic field as well. So there's one good point. The other one is much more interesting, and that comes from the Catholic side, is that it says that the Turk is also God's creation. The Turk is also a man or a human. Therefore, he is God's creation. Therefore, he possesses God's gifts as well. Therefore, he is also capable of God's mercy. And if he is capable of God's mercy, if he does this, he is also worthy of salvation. And this is from, again, coming from the turn of the 16th, 17th century. And it is a very interesting narrative because it not just gives a human aspect to the Ottoman, so the Turk, as I mentioned, the enemy, the faceless enemy, anything is the Turk, it is wrong. It humanizes it, and it gives the chance of salvation, meaning you can be saved, you can go in a positive route as well. So the merciful Samaritan existed in these German territories as a parallel, but this imagery focused mostly on Saxony. So in Western Germany, you don't see anything like it. In Hungary, you definitely don't see anything like this. Also, I found similar paintings in the Netherlands, which is just Oriental coating. So it is not just for the Oriental topic. But in the Saxon German, it is actualized. So it made a very interesting addition. And because I wanted to search the Samaritan in all the other parts of Europe, I found some interesting narratives. This is my only Western European mention here, because Guillaume Postel, one of the first Orientalists in the 16th century, actually wrote about the Samaritans as being basically the part of the Turkish origin story. So the Turks would come from the Samaritans. The Samaritans were the excluded people, and then who probably the Samaritans would turn into Muslims later, and the Turks would come from them, according to Postel's theory. Postel had a very, very interesting line of theories, but this is one of the big mentions that he did in the 16th century. Samaritan, either in the 16th, 17th century, so far, no. Definitely not in a positive context. The only Hungarian context I found is from Francis Rákóczi II, the one who did the rebellion in the 1700s, when he was in his exile in the Ottoman Empire in the 1730s. Because Rákóczi at first went to exile to Poland, and then he went to France, and then from France he came to the Ottoman Empire. Because he basically just fell out of love with Louis XIV's court. And in his confessions, in his personal diary or memoir, he writes that the Turk as a Samaritan welcomes me and actually attends to my wounds. So he is a thankful individual. It's nothing cultural, it is nothing public, it is nothing religious. These are the words of a single person who is very grateful for being actually at the Ottoman side after being basically left alone by other Christian powers. So an example, nonetheless, but doesn't prove the point that it existed in Hungary overall, but it definitely shows a very interesting small part, positive imagery in Central Europe, where the mainstream narrative of the Ottomans would be the dominantly negative, the apocalyptic, or the outright the great other, the great enemy. And this shows how colorful this research topic still is. It can still show you some surprises, some interesting sources. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.